And then I became aware of a light, and my body started moving closer to the light. There was a radiance that glowing that actually warmed me up.
Welcome to the Spirits Beside Us podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lippincott. I'm an ex-Wall Street analyst turned international medium, spiritual teacher, and best-selling author. Each week we'll dive into the fascinating and uplifting arena of the non-physical world to help you deepen your understanding and spiritual connection to the unseen realm. We'll also share a behind-the-scenes look with others who've done the same and speak with experts in the field about their experiences. Pull up a seat and let's dive into these perspective-changing conversations. Well, welcome everybody, and welcome to another episode of Spirits Beside Us. I can't wait to interview and speak with our next guest. Today is going to be a fantastic episode. I just can't wait. We've got Dr. Michael Hession, who is a physician who's been in practice for, I think, over 30 years, if I'm correct. But he's had some incredible experiences, specifically 2 near-death experiences, where he's been able to have the perspective on what we all live through, what we all have that perspective changed. And I think it's going to be a wonderful conversation where we're talking about, what's out there and how and how we all live. So, Dr. Hession, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chris, for having me.
Well, perhaps one of the things that you can help us understand first off is your background as a physician. I think around 30 years or so in the medical practice, and you're up in Massachusetts. I think you're sort of also cardiology, if I recall. So perhaps you can give us sort of a background about your medical expertise.
Sure. So I graduated from Dartmouth Medical School. I did my internal medicine residency at Boston Medical Center. And from there, I went on to do my cardiology fellowship at the Brigham Women's Hospital under Dr. Bernard Lown. I've been in practice since 1985.
Okay, so that's a good long time. And in that practice and in your studies, how were you taught to think about the world around you? Was it a very materialist view? Was it a very grounded view? Had you gone at it from a scientific perspective? What was sort of the approach as you were going down that road?
Much of medical school training, pretty much all of it, in internship, residency, and fellowship is really to master an enormous amount of science. In residency and internship, in fellowship, you begin to learn the finer points of caring for patients and understanding them, and understanding fully that it's an honor and a privilege to be taking care of another human being, and they need to be treated with absolute respect and dignity. Unfortunately, the system, sometimes you're in a crisis mode where you're dealing with emergencies, and they're really the situation doesn't lend itself oftentimes to getting to know the person as deeply as you might like to while you're dealing with the emergency. But I think that really hasn't changed. I think all physicians are trained first in the science part during medical school, and then during their internship, residency, and fellowship on the more finer aspects of how to talk to patients, how to lead them through the process, the understanding of what's going on, and also their families.
I'm curious. How does the medical community think about when people are concerned about death? The families are concerned about death. The patients are concerned about death. How does the medical community in general treat that? It's not even part of in their wheelhouse. So how does it discuss it? How does it think about it? How does it address that topic?
It's awkward. Not everybody is good at it as they should be. I think there's an increasing awareness that uh, understanding of what palliative care, medicine, and hospice really should be, and when it should be introduced. It's important that everybody understand we all die, and that physicians can't really save everybody. And sometimes the best that you can do is to help the patient and the family prepare for death. Do everything you can to keep them comfortable, but the disease process is overwhelming and can't be stopped. And not everybody does a really good job with that. That's a very uncomfortable place for a lot of physicians. And there's a whole specialty of medicine, palliative care and hospice medicine that they're using the consultant basis inside the hospital to bring in. They're asked to come in and meet with the family and the patients and really discuss end of life care, goals of care. Not an easy discussion. I think all of our training is really spent in helping to keep people alive, and the realization that at some point we all die, not something that really people readily want to talk about, but it's an everyday experience.
Right. And how does the medical community, again, in general, it always hears, for example, in ICU, that patients somehow step outside themselves. They have these external experiences, or they'll be in an experience where suddenly, if they're in ICU, or maybe they're even in surgery, they'll have an out of body experience, and they'll have an experience where some say they're floating above the room, they're hearing things that they couldn't normally hear. But the medical community dismisses that as sort of a chemical, almost narcotic of some kind, just driven by the chemicals in the brain. How do you see that, and how do you see, how that is juxtaposed the way the medical community has typically, attributed that?
It's a fascinating question. That actually happened to me when I became sick in the last week of December of 2013. Just started off with a cold and then rapidly went downhill. And by New Year's Eve in 2013, I awoke unable to breathe. My wife had already been awakened by my labored breathing, and she's a nurse. We both knew I was in trouble, and we called 911. I was brought to the emergency room, a place that I had worked for decades. And after evaluating me, the x-rays and the lab work, they said I was dying, and that if I didn't start life support, that I wouldn't make it. And I was placed on life support, and things are a bit of a blur. But at some point, I remember very distinctly voices of two women talking, and they're talking about me in the past tense. I said, wait, I'm still here. And then I heard another voice, and it was a priest praying for me, giving me the last rites reserved for people who are dying. And that was really hard to understand. It was like, what's going on here? And then it was that moment that I realized the prayers were for me, that I was dying. Time ceased to be a dimension for me once I was intubated. I didn't have my glasses on, couldn't interact, didn't know what day it was, what time it was. At one point, after being suctioned, I felt everything go black, and in the distance I could hear her crying and wailing, and I tried to see who it was, and it was my family, and they were reaching out, trying to grab me, and I was floating away into the darkness, and everything became black. My body became cold, and the sensation of floating in the dark void was actually somewhat pleasant. And then I became aware of a light, and my body started moving closer to the light, and there was a radiance that a glowing that actually warmed me up. And the voice said, Michael, this is not your time. You must go back. There's much to do. And I felt myself becoming warm again and moving again. And the next thing I knew was my wife talking into my ear, telling me that good news. The doctors have said you're responding to the treatment, and they're going to be able to dial back on the ventilator settings. So that was a pretty profound event. So I'd have to say there's no scientific explanation for it. I've read them. They're hypotheses, opinion, not fact. I think what happened was very real. I think it can be best understood if you approach it from a position of faith. From a position of science, it is really impossible to come up with an explanation. So that's how I respond to the people who've written those articles.
Right. So, from your personal perspective, are you able to go into greater detail about your experience as you were traveling into the light? Quite often in NDEs, participants describe it as first floating off into a tunnel. It's, as you described, kind of a magnetic pull towards something. Most of them describe a light, and then they'll have some kind of encounter with somebody. Sometimes it feels like the encounter's a long period of time. Sometimes it's there is no sense of time, but they're having conversations with somebody. What was your experience like? Do you recall any details?
Well, I felt myself floating into the darkness, and I couldn't see what force was pulling me. The force that was trying to keep me present had disappeared. I could no longer see my family or feel their hands trying to grab me. As the light became brighter, there was a sense of calm, of peacefulness that took hold. I no longer felt afraid. And I can't explain why, but that was what happened. And I can't tell you how long this whole event lasted. It could have been seconds, minutes, days. Time was no longer a dimension, but it definitely was real. It still stay with me. I can remember the event vividly, even though it's been close to a decade since it happened. I haven't found any scientific explanation that can clearly scientifically prove what occurred. I understand some of the studies have shown there's a convergence of synapses, and it can create a sensation of a bright light. But that may account for the bright light, but it can't account for everything else. I later learned, over a month later, actually, that my wife had asked everybody she knew, our church congregation, to pray for me. And my best friend, his daughters, graduated from Notre Dame University in South Bend. And they had called Notre Dame and asked that prayers be said for me at the replica grotto to Our Lady of Lourdes there. And I had visited that when my son was looking at colleges. His daughter was a freshman there, and I remember seeing it. It's a replica of the grotto that exists in France. And when they told me that story, it kind of like clicked that my belief was what I saw was the Our Lady of Lourdes. And I promised myself that I would, at some point when I was strong enough, go to France and visit Lourdes. So in 2015, my son was getting his master's at the Sorbonne. And so we went to visit him. And we took a little side trip to Lourdes. It was a pretty quick flight. And it was amazing, Chris. The statue, it was very much what I remember in my mind's eye that I saw. And I've never forgotten it. And my belief, and it's a belief based on faith, that somehow those prayers were heard and that something happened. And those prayers resulted in my living. And so from a standpoint of faith, I can say this was a very real experience, and prayer played a very big part in it. And it was a very peaceful feeling, and it took away my fear. I no longer fear death. I know it's an inevitable outcome of life, but having experienced it near death twice now, I can say really I'm not afraid. And I think we fear the unknown. It's a natural human response. But to your listeners, I would say, based on my experience, that at least from what I saw, it was very peaceful. And I would encourage people to continue in their belief.
So you've had 2 NDEs, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So what was the other NDE like?
Not quite so dramatic, but it was in 2015, after we came back from France visiting our son. I woke in the middle of the night with abdominal pain, and I had again rushed to the hospital. It was determined I had a diverticular abscess, and that I would need surgery. I had to be treated with antibiotics first, so I had a PICC line placed, a long line that can stand for quite a while. And I completed the antibiotics and I underwent the surgery. And at the time, I was still being slowly tapered off the prednisone. One of the treatments for acute respiratory distress syndrome or cytokine storm is high dose steroids. It's the one thing that works. There's no treatment, there's no cure for acute respiratory distress syndrome. It's an unregulated runaway freight train where your body attacks itself. And it's an immune-related response, and steroids are powerful immunosuppressants. But they're fairly non-selective. And one of the side effects is they interfere with healing. And I was still being tapered off of the prednisone at that time, of the steroids at that time. So I had my surgery and was discharged home, was feeling great. And several days later, the anastomosis, where the abscess had been removed and the intestines sutured back together, leaked. And it was essentially, in medical terms, it was an abdominal catastrophe. By the time I got to the hospital, I was in septic shock. My blood pressure was about 60 something when I got to the emergency room. And shortly after getting put into a bed, I lost consciousness. And I woke up. I still had the vision of what I had seen previously. And I realized I wasn't going to die, but it was more, in some ways, a more difficult recovery than the first one, which I was still recovering from. The surgery, because my whole abdominal contents was contaminated. They couldn't close the wound up, so when I looked down, I could, my there was some packing, but my stomach was wide open down to my intestines, and it was it was pretty shocking. But I still saw the image of the woman in the radiant flowing robes saying again, "It's not my time." So I knew I was going to recover, and I just knew it was going to be a long, difficult road to recover from. But
So what was it like? Do you recall the what what you might refer to as the transition from the physical to the non-physical? Because typically, we'll refer to a person who is, their body is dead. The consciousness transitions from, the place in the physical reality transitions to a non-physical reality. So, in that transition, do you recall what the transition felt like? Was it just sort of a continuation of everything of in your awareness, as many have described? What was the transition itself like?
well, I remember the second one. I was talking to the surgeon, and then the nurse said his pressure is dropping, and that's the last thing that I remember. And then again, I felt myself floating in the darkness, and so I was not consciously aware of what was going on around me. I'd gone into that place where I was floating in space, and the second time, I didn't experience the terror that I did with the first time, the first episode, the first time this happened. The words that it was not my time came back again, and I knew I was going to get through it, but I didn't quite know how. Um, I didn't know exactly what was in store for me, but I knew it was going to be very painful.
So, as you were transitioning into this void, or the connection down into where this woman was, you were still what, aware of your surroundings. So did you still think of yourself as, I'm still intact somewhere?
Well, the last thing I remember was I was in the stretcher in the emergency room, and the surgeon speaking to me, and then there was a flurry of activity saying, "We're losing him." And at that point, I lost consciousness, and I really couldn't say that I was aware of what was going on in the physical world. I went to that place again where I was drifting in space, and it was a different dimension. It was there was no sound really. It was just a peaceful feeling of drifting, and again the light and the words from the woman in the radiant gown and the warmth that emanated from her was very peaceful. And she again assured me it was not my time. And I didn't feel afraid. The first time I was terrified. I didn't know what was going on. And the second time I knew I was in trouble. I knew I was no longer independent of external life support. I was on life support and external life support. So my bodily functions were not my own. And it's really hard to describe because there was no time, space. They were no longer dimensions. I was just floating, and it was a peaceful feeling. Even though I knew something very bad was happening, I knew that somehow I would get through it.
So with this, so you've had the awareness of this peaceful floating feeling. You had the encounter, and you come back. In both cases, especially after the second one, how did you begin to readapt to the physical world? If you've realized that there's something beyond the physical world, how did your perspective change on life, your life, leading life, what others should be leading with their lives, since it's clearly it opened up new possibilities.
It did. I, I think I was, my parents were very religious. So I was raised, you know, with strong faith. I didn't really think much about it. My life was pretty busy with being a doctor, being a husband, taking care of two children, raising them. Other than going to church, it didn't really, on Sunday, it really didn't, wasn't something that I thought of continuously. When I awoke, the second time, in many ways was more terrifying than the first. I had spent over a year, it was about 14 months recovering, working very hard, gaining my physical strength back. Because the first time, when the pneumonia was felt to be under control enough that I could come off the ventilator, when I woke, they found I was paralyzed. I had Guillain-Barré as a complication of the viral pneumonia. And there was a lot of discussion about what should happen. And eventually it was agreed upon that I would go to Spalding Hospital for intensive rehabilitation. And when I was transferred there, I really didn't know what to expect. All my experience as a physician had been in caring for acutely ill patients. Patients with heart attacks, patients with congestive heart failure, patients with arrhythmia. Really, my experience and my training had not really prepared me for what I was going to be going through, the rehabilitative portion of medicine. And when I arrived at Spalding, I got off the elevator on my stretcher. I was on the spinal cord unit. That was a complete shock. Being paralyzed was always one of my greatest fears. And, my mind just kind of just imploded. I couldn't really comprehend what was going on. But in retrospect, it made sense. I was, although a well-documented complication of our illnesses, it's not something that you see every day. So there's no specialized, wards or facilities that treat Guillain-Barré. So it's very similar to what you would if you were recovering from a spinal cord injury. I had to learn again how to swallow, to eat. I couldn't safely swallow. I couldn't move my hands. I couldn't move my legs. I couldn't do anything. Little by little, they brought me back. I mean, it was very painful, difficult, exhausting therapy. But after 6 weeks, I got to the point where I was able to use, to get around with crutches, off-strand crutches, which are specific for patients to use who have neuromuscular causes of their paralysis. You remember Forrest Gump? He had those crutches when he was Forrest Gump crutches. Then there was a lot of months and months and months of hard work with the rehabilitation, first at home, then going to rehabilitation pretty much daily. three formal days a week, and then the other days were on my own. I'd come a long way. I still couldn't walk easily. I had to use some. I was taught how to use these like Nordic walking sticks. These in cross country skiing, and they helped me walk. And so I was independent. When this second episode occurred, the healing from the abdominal catastrophe was going to be a long process. It was going to require more surgery and prolonged amount of inactivity, and bed rest inactivity leads to loss of muscle strength and mobility. So within a couple of weeks, I had pretty much lost most of what I had spent over a year regaining. And I was facing more surgery. And it was very discouraging to face what was ahead of me. So even though I knew and I was reassured that I was going to live, the pain and the difficult rehabilitation that I was going to have to go through again with more surgery and more rehabilitation was hard to comprehend. I just, I had to start over again. And I had to psychologically really build myself up and work hard to focus on small things, small goals, the building blocks of my recovery.
So it sounds like you've had, you're rebuilding just from the first NDE. Your body had already given out. You've got everything where you're finally almost back to where you had started. So you'd almost fully recovered. Yet now you have the second NDE, and there's an even longer stretch of recovery just to get back to where you to basically cover everything you'd already done that entire time previously. So you've got all this work ahead of you. What did you begin to think to yourself? Was this something like, why is this happening to me, or how can I do this, or did you see a purpose in it? What was going through your head?
I couldn't see a purpose in it. I really felt like Job. I didn't know how I was going to move forward. It was overwhelming. And I really almost couldn't see a way forward. And it took a while just for the shock of the whole experience to sink in. The peacefulness, the inner peace and calm that I had, knowing that I wasn't going to die, was very reassuring and can't be minimized. But that is not to minimize the horror that what was ahead of me, what had happened to me and what was ahead of me. And I had to really dig down deep, rely on my faith and my own personal resilience to find a way back. And as I said, it was too much to really even imagine what it was going to take. I just had to believe that in the end I would find a way.
So how long did this second recovery take? Was that 18 months? How long did it finally get for you to get back to be sort of back to your, I want to call it normal self or functional self? Or
Not as long as the first time. It really Took me about 5 months to
Okay.
get back to the point where I could drive, that I could walk outside, that I could, because I had to have more surgery in the interim. So each one of those took a toll. But it was about 5 months before I began to develop the rhythms of what you would call a normal life. I was able to be independent. I was able to drive. I started back to work part-time, doing administrative functions. And then over the ensuing months afterwards, I gradually got back to seeing patients.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about your perspective, sort of post versus before. Before, were you seeing patients in that typical training of the medical community, the medical world, where it's just kind of like you got to process through them, you've got your time, time stamp, you've got to see as many as you possibly can, and then after all these NDEs, what was it like then? How was your perspective changed?
Well, before these illnesses, I'd be up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'd get into the hospital, start in the intensive care units, seeing the sickest patients first, finish with the hospital, then get into the office and see my list of patients. And they would maybe 15 minutes to half an hour, depending upon the complexity of the patient. And then I would go back to the hospital at the end of the day, and then I would go home. Get home around 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and I would be on call. We would share call with my partners and do weekend coverage. We'd be on call Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It was a long weekend. And after my illness, I really wasn't physically able to do that. My walking was, it never came back to completely independent. I needed to use the walking sticks. I couldn't run to emergencies. My days of covering the hospital were over, but I was able to see patients in the office. And I would look at my schedule. I wasn't really so much concerned about staying on time as to listening to what each person needed to say. So my focus shifted really to being one of sympathy and curiosity, scientific curiosity, to one of empathy. And I could relate to the patients, their confusion, their not understanding what was going on with their body, not being in control of the process. I had lived that. So I could really, in a very, very completely different way, something you could never learn in medical school or in training. But having gone through this experience, these two experiences, I could really relate to the patients at a very different level. And in some ways, it was almost subliminal. They could sense it. I could feel it. There was a closer bond. And I was able to help people in a different way. And for many of the patients, sometimes it was helping them deal with the fact that their illness was not curable. There are some things that we could help to treat it, make them feel better. But in the end, it was going to claim their lives, and to help them order their life priorities, what's important to them at that time, what are the things that were important for them to achieve before whatever illness they had was going to eventually claim their life. So I engaged really at a much different level with the patients because of my experience.
Interesting. So it sounds like that you stepped into their shoes. So because of that, you gained that empathy. You're suddenly able to communicate with them on a completely different level. and talk to them about things that perhaps you never would have been able to communicate with them before.
True. Exactly true. I think experiencing near death taught me many lessons. It helped me become a better person and a better physician. And I was able to help people in ways that I hadn't even considered before. And it helped me make a difference. I felt as though I had meaning and purpose, and that I had something to offer that was unique. And it gave me joy, and I was able to help a lot of people.
Great. Now, you've written a book about all of your experiences and how your perspectives shift. And tell us about that.
So the book is called Physician Heal Thyself. Nearly Dead and the Journey Back to Health. I wrote the book from the perspective of a patient who is also a physician, and what it's like to go through the unimaginable, something you cannot prepare yourself for. I shared a lot of the strategies that I used to get through it, to stay sane, strategies on how to build my resilience, strategies on how I found meaning and purpose and happiness again. Being sick with anything is very disruptive, profoundly disruptive, not only to you, but to your family members. My illness took a tremendous toll on my spouse and my children and my loved ones. And everyone's affected. And I realized that I had some post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms from being, as I alluded to earlier, being intubated in the ICU and being aware of what was going on, being terrified, not knowing. As a physician, I probably knew too much. I knew I was in very deep trouble and I was going to probably die. And there wasn't really anything I could do about it. I had complete loss of control. And I talk about how you deal with these symptoms. And that when I was recovering, I tried to read up as much as I could on how people recover. And to my surprise, there weren't an awful lot of books that really dealt with how a person recovers from an illness. I think there was some interesting books about people's experience of dying. Some of the most powerful books that I read that helped me were Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, Admiral Stockdale's description of being a prisoner of war in Vietnam for 6 years, Louis Zamperini's World War II imprisonment as a Japanese prisoner of war, his torture, his eventual release, his spiral into alcoholism and near death, and then rebuilding his life. And each of these gave me insight on how you can do it. One of the most powerful books I read was a book by Angela Duckworth called Grit. It's an interesting book. She's a psychologist at Penn, and her doctoral thesis was on why it's not your intelligence or being the smartest that leads to an individual's success, either as an athlete or in business. And she broke it down into what, in her doctoral dissertation, into what she described as two important things: passion and perseverance. And she came to the conclusion, and taking the histories of successful athletes and successful actors, successful businessmen, that it wasn't how much knowledge you had or how gifted you were, but it was your perseverance, never quitting. It reminded me of lessons my father taught me. You know, he grew up during the Depression. He immigrated to this country in 1929, not a auspicious time to come to the United States. But he said, if you never quit, if you fall down, you pick yourself up every time. And that was one of the lessons that I learned in Viktor Frankl, Admiral Stockdale, even going back to the Stoic philosophers, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. The key thing in life was whenever you come across any challenge, no matter how insurmountable, even if you have no idea how you're going to get through it, you just put one foot in front of the other, you never quit. Confucius said, the glory in life is never in falling, but in getting up every time you fall. And I realized these words were not just simple aphorisms. These were really powerful life lessons. And I use them. And I talk in my book of how anyone can use them. Because there weren't really, as much as this book was my story, it was really the story of my way of helping other people show how you can recover from unimaginable circumstances. And I think it does a good job. I have a website, Acknowledge, Accept, Adapt. I write a monthly blog, and the book has been selling very well on Amazon. It's also available in many bookstores. And, I started to do motivational speaking about this. And it's amazing. I found it amazing how many people who had real life experiences, either themselves or their loved ones, in varying degrees, going through the same emotions and struggling with how to find a way to move forward. So I think there's a lot of lessons in here, both for physicians and nurses in training or even in practice, as well as for patients and patients' family members, on how you can survive some of life's unpredictable challenges.
Well, it sounds like you've got some great pieces of advice, especially the grit. I love that grit, determination, and perseverance. Just keep on, putting one foot in front of the other, which is perhaps something that we all could use. So it really sounds like that was the greatest takeaway that you had, not only from the NDEs, but the resulting aftermaths of the NDEs that you had. And that's really what kind of has brought you to where you are today and what you're now sharing with everybody else.
Yes, I think in sharing my story, I found a way to help many, many, many more people than I probably ever could have as a physician caring for patients individually. And I think the book and my speaking will help a lot of people. I think, unfortunately, the human existence is fragile. We all, at some point, die. No one wants to admit it, but it's having a good death is it's a hard to imagine concept. But a lot of it, as with anything in life, is in preparing yourself for how you're going to deal with any eventuality. And I think what I try to do, and I think I achieve significantly, is showing people a way as to how you can deal with the unimaginable, how you can overcome what seems impossible, really by taking one step at a time. And if you fall, pick yourself up. The power is in never quitting, always moving forward.
Great. Well, those are wise words. Is there any one piece of advice that you'd be able to give to a listener who's been listening to this so far Sounds like some of what you've said is already in there, but any other words of wisdom for a listener?
Well, I think most important thing is to have a belief that somehow you'll persevere. That was one of the things that Viktor Frankl and Admiral Stockdale said. The people who didn't survive Auschwitz, the people who didn't survive being a prisoner of war in Vietnam, were those that were living in the past, couldn't accept the horror of the present. The only people that survived Auschwitz, the only people that survived Vietnam intact, were those that could somehow look to the future. And it's a unique thing with human beings that if we can look to the future, we can find hope and a reason to move forward. So believe in the future, never quit.
That's great. Yeah, believe in the future, never quit. I love that. That's something that really will pull people forward.
I hope
Well,
so.
Dr. Hession, this has been fabulous. I love everything that you've been mentioning, and I can't read to read your book. It'll be front and center on my bookshelf, so that'll be great. But again, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Chris. Have a good day.
Okay, well, you too. Thank you so much. And for everybody who's listening, thank you for tuning in. I hope you got something wonderful from today's show. And always remember, like and subscribe to the episode, so that way you'll constantly be reminded that you are getting the next episode. And remember that coming up early October, we have a special event coming on, so you'll see all the information down the show notes, something you'll definitely want to tune into. So for now, this is Chris signing off, saying you love and light, and I will see you next time. Bye for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Spirits Beside Us. Make sure you head over to the show notes for all the links and information on this week's episode. You can check it out at spiritsbesideus.com. If you love this episode as much as I did, head over to rate and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Also, if you're looking for a community of spiritual seekers like yourself, make sure you join my Facebook page, Spirits Beside Us Podcast on Facebook. This is Chris signing off, sending you love and light. I can't wait to connect with you again on Wednesday.